right, coming to you live from Dantooine. We brought the cantina where it's nice, and we're not on Tatooine in Las Vegas. I hear I'm pixelated, so you might not be able to see that. But just to show everyone watching, listening, that the cantina can go anywhere. We're not stuck in a particular place. We're much like the Temple of God, where it's not geographical. We can go wherever we want. So I'm in Georgia right now. The other two are still in the boring desert. But I'm
I
Drake.
like the desert.
I like the desert too, but it's nice to see a tree and like, oh, that's how we get oxygen. Yeah, it doesn't
It's
come
nice
from the
to see a
sand.
tree.
Yeah, like a natural tree that actually, humans didn't plant there to make your neighborhood look nice. Um, but yeah, I'm Drake. Nice to see everybody. Uh, that's all I'm going to say. That's my introduction today. I'm going to be short.
What are we talking about, Drake?
Well, I'll get to that.
We
He
didn't
said
introduce
that's all I'm
ourselves.
gonna say.
Well, because he's talking about his introduction.
My introduction.
Okay. Well, I'm April Cato. I'm a wife and mother. That's all I have to say.
It's too much information.
And I'm not
Brian.
a pastor.
Oh, you should have said that first.
I'm not a pastor.
And I'm Brian, and I like the desert because there are no bugs.
There are bugs.
Well,
Amen
not as
to
many.
that.
There are things There are things worse than bugs in where we live.
Not really.
I saw a tarantula the size of my head.
Tarantulas can't do anything.
You can hold a tarantula. Like I'm worried
Thank
about. Like
you.
I'm tired of all the gnats and mosquitoes and millions of bugs from every which way.
Yeah. Well, fortunately, the time of season right now, there's like no bugs here. Well,
that's nice.
It's way less than normal. Anyway,
just a bunch of gators.
No, we're not that far south. The gators aren't up here.
Okay.
Yeah, we just have bass and some other.
I just picture the deep south as like nothing but swampland.
No, that's that's further down. We're still we're in the Appalachian area. This is like where everyone has the meth labs. That's where we are. We're in the Appalachian area. This is where like moonshining. You got to get further south to get the gators and the bayou kind of stuff.
Nice.
Yeah. So, but yeah, all right. So the topic tonight is a very culturally relevant, or I would say like across the spectrum, church and just people that are into politics, because there is a interview with our vice president and someone named Margaret, I think, where they were talking about immigration or something. And this idea of loving your neighbor came up. I actually haven't watched the interview totally. I did see the I don't care Margaret meme part, which is what everyone's touting. But it's kind of sparked this conversation in the church, which is well, okay, look, even these political guys, which have a Christian leaning, are talking about loving your neighbor, and this is something we should talk about, because the church doesn't know how to love its neighbor, which is generally a true statement. The church doesn't know how to love its neighbor because it doesn't know who its neighbor is, and I think that's ultimately the whole point of the argument, right? Who is your neighbor? Who is Christ talking about? In a couple of places, Good Samaritan, when he summarizes the law and loving your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And then Leviticus 19, which we're going to read as well, which basically is those two commandments as well. And I think it goes back to some other podcasts we've talked about, like who's the image of God. It's all going to come into play here, but that is the topic. The Ordo Amoris, right, is the term that, to be very honest, I don't think anyone has heard of except for pastors and scholars, or people, maybe the Roman Catholic Church that know some liturgical Latin, wouldn't know what that means. And here we are thrust upon us. So that's what we're talking about. Brian, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that we have a different religion in America than Christianity. I think that people confuse the religion of what I would call the religion of the Enlightenment, which is you have a kind of a more generic God, and there was a basically creed of early liberals, early kind of Enlightenment thinkers who were quote unquote Christian. They still claimed Christ and whatnot, but they had this creed of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, and that has been kind of the assumption of liberalism. Liberalism is really not Christianity. It's really Enlightenment religion that has been syncretized with Christianity. And a lot of Christians who actually are Christians now have adopted those assumptions. And by doing so, they've adopted basically a kind of more liberal idea that God is the father of everyone and everyone is your brother. And then, of course, that's rejected by people who are in the know, in terms of the explicit statement, but then it's kind of rustled in through the image of God. So everyone's the image of God, and therefore in that way they have that special relationship with God as father. And the neighbor, everyone's your neighbor, and therefore everyone's kind of your brother in that way. And so I think the problem is that the Bible doesn't present us that way. It actually presents the people of God and the people of frankly the devil as two different groups who are not neighbors and are not equally the image of God.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there's a. Go ahead, April.
Go ahead, Drake.
Well, I was to say there's yeah, Christianity, or I guess back like in the Enlightenment or whatever, there's like this amorphous blob that is Christianity now. So like if you look at like before the cross, we'd all agree there are nations that God chose, there are nations that God didn't choose. He judged, right? Israel was the nation that God chose, and um, it was clear. It was a lot clearer who your neighbor was then, right? Because it's your fellow Israelite or something like that. But the cross has somehow obliterated the idea of covenant community, uh, communion, right? So your neighbor being like again a fellow Israelite. This time, instead of being a nation, it's in a spiritual way. Those who are in Christ are your neighbor. But they've kind of expanded that and said, well, that's not loving enough. God would never do that. He's so loving. We're all connected to him as we were originally back in Genesis 1 or Genesis 2 when we were created in his image.
Well, yeah, I literally saw someone in response to like the immigration issue say, well, I guess for Christians, John 15, I forget the verses because it's all over John,
Yeah.
is out the window. And I was like,
Yeah.
that's talking about loving one another, referring to Christians.
Right.
That's not talking about you are loving like pagans in the world or any of that. And of course, I guess we should probably start out by defining the Ordo. I was gonna say Ordo Salutis, but Ordo Amoris, which is just means the order of loves, right? So you have a particular order of love to where you have more responsibility to your family than you do to another family. You have more responsibility to your nation than you do to another nation. Maybe within the United States, you have more responsibility to your state, maybe than you have to other states. That sort of idea that it goes out from there. And we would argue that because Christians today don't understand the neighbor concept, they're not understanding that they have more obligation to Christians than they do to non-Christians, and that the love that we're told to have is for one another. And this is really important. I don't mean a feeling of empathy when I say love. That's not what the Bible's talking about mostly when it talks about love. When it talks about compassion, it can talk about that. But when you talk about love and hate are usually in the context of who do you prefer, who do you choose when there's a choice to be made over another. So when God says, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated, he goes on to say in Malachi that he's going to protect Jacob, then he's going to protect Israel and save them. and he's going to destroy and give Edom over to destruction, because he has to choose one or the other. Edom's attacking Israel. They're at odds with one another. So it's either he chooses Edom or he chooses Israel, and he's going to choose Israel over Edom. Jesus makes the statement that, he who loves father and mother more than me is not worthy of me, or he does not hate his father and mother is not worthy of being my disciple. And Jesus isn't saying, disobey the commandment to honor your father and mother and not love them. He's actually just saying, look, you need to choose me when it comes down to it. If there's a conflict, you choose me over your parents.
Yeah.
Or you can't be my disciple. And so that's really important, I think. And we have an obligation of love to our neighbor over those who are not our neighbor, and therefore it becomes really important to understand who the neighbor is.
I was going to interject, but I think my point will come out later down the line, because I think it would just kind of thrust us too far down the conversation.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think one point to that, though, is, I guess, back to what Drake was saying, we do have kind of a dispensational understanding of the neighbor. It's like, well, in the Old Testament, clearly, there was the covenant people, and they had certain obligations and responsibilities to one another. But now, because the Gentiles have been brought in, now all of a sudden those distinctions or responsibilities within the covenant community have somehow evaporated, which I think is a big part of the problem. I think the other part, and it kind of goes back to what you were saying, is that when you're choosing who to love and who to hate, and within the context of the neighbor, a lot of that comes into who you give your resources to or your preference to. Liberalism tends to choose the non-believer over the believer in preference. And it's specifically tied to the social gospel movement, that there's this idea that it's not the gospel that's the power of God unto salvation. It's the gospel plus my work at the soup kitchen, or, me giving you $20 on the street or whatever. The gospel somehow needs to be tied to some kind of met needs for the people. And that's a big part of this. It's a misunderstanding of not just neighbor, but it's a misunderstanding of how people are saved.
Well, what's funny is that the big forefather of the social gospel movement, I think it was Rosenbusch, I want to say, he understood that Christianity was exclusive to loving one another. And he said that in order for his thing to go forth, his social gospel to go forth, he would have to actually destroy Orthodox Christianity, because Orthodox Christianity has boundaries. And his whole idea is that there are no boundaries, because that's the liberal idea, right? There are no boundaries. Yep. Everyone's a child of God. Everybody's a brother, all that sort of thing. What's funny with the dispensational argument is that the transfer from the Old Testament to the New wouldn't be from the exclusive group of Israel to all the world, because all the world doesn't belong to God all of a sudden. It would be the exclusive group of Israel to the church. Even if you don't believe the church is Israel, now we do, but even if you don't believe the church is Israel, it'd be the community of God to the community of God. That's the parallel, not the community of God to the community of the devil and everyone else. That's ridiculous. And so I actually, maybe we should read Leviticus 19 in context, because that's what the New Testament's going to quote when it talks about the duty of the Christian. And so it's referencing Leviticus 19. And so we should probably know what Leviticus 19 actually says. Where did I have it at? I think it was at 16. Yeah, start at 16 and go to 18.
Okay. You must not go about as a slanderer among your people. You must not stand idly by when your neighbor's life is at stake. I am the Lord. You must not hate your brother in your heart. You must surely reprove your fellow citizen, so that you do not incur sin on account of him. You must not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the children of your people, but you must love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord.
Okay, that was lovely. But let me actually just read it one more time and emphasize what I think people what I think people run over.
He's like, that was great, but I hated it, so let me do it myself.
It's
Well,
so boring.
I think that was good because that's how people read it, right? They read it quickly like that, but they may not pay attention. So I want them to pay attention. So here we go again. You shall not go about as a slanderer among your people. You are not to act against the life of your neighbor. So your people and your neighbor are parallel. You shall not hate your fellow countrymen in your heart. You may surely reprove your neighbor. So fellow countrymen, neighbor, same thing. But you shall not incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Again, the parallel of the neighbor, sons of your people. It's so your fellow countrymen, the sons of, it's basically the sons of your people. It's the among your people. So your people, your countrymen, that's your neighbor, and it's referring to fellow Israelites. So what we get from that is understanding that neighbor means fellow covenant community member. That's what it means. So when you go into the New Testament and you see neighbor, that's what it's talking about. Now it is true. What one of the things I think people mistakenly confuse and think, oh well, your neighbor is everyone. As they go to Matthew 5, where Jesus says, it's been said to you, you love your neighbor but hate your enemy. And there, what had been done is the Jews actually took neighbor to mean just Jews in the context now that Gentiles are included. And not only Jews, but maybe just friends, because neighbor can also refer to your friend. And so that's why Christ says, don't just eat with, the people that you like. Everybody does that or whatever, your friends or whatever. And what he's trying to say is that within the covenant community, it's not just your friends and people you like that you're to love. You're to love those who actually are in even opposition to you within the covenant community, personally speaking. If you have personal feuds going on and whatnot, then you are to actually turn the other cheek, love them, invite them for dinner, pray for them who are persecuting you. And persecution there is not they're hanging you on crosses like they're Romans who are trying to kill you. It's people who say bad things about you. That Matthew makes that very clear in the Sermon on the Mount at the beginning. So I think it's important to understand there that neighbor is not being expanded to everyone. And even in that text, he says, you've heard you'll love your neighbor but hate your enemy, but I say love your enemies. He doesn't say everybody's your neighbor. He just says, oh, well, the people who are your enemies, love them too, and then pray for them as well. And so I think there's a misunderstanding that somehow he's expanded it to everyone, when in fact there's nothing that indicates Christ is expanded to everyone. And in fact, we're going to read a little bit later here the parable of the Good Samaritan and show that it's not expanded to everyone in that parable, even though everyone reads it that way and thinks that's what it says.
Well, what's interesting is when you see instances in the New Testament where things are expanded, quote unquote, expanded beyond what was understood. So let's take with the divorce from a marriage, Matthew 19, right?
Yeah.
When you have an expansion on something that's not the social norm, there's a reaction by the people like, who should get married? Who can do this? Like, this seems like impossible. When Christ is given the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 and going over this text, there is no such departure from what the social norm is. Like, you can imagine if Christ's application was to the goyim or the people that are not his people, there would have been lots of grumbling, right? The Pharisees would have been like,
Yeah.
or even the disciples would have been like, wait, I'm supposed to love the Roman that's trying to is taking everything from me,
Worshiping
or
Zeus.
or worshiping Zeus, yeah, or like any Gentile really, that's not categorized as the covenant community.
We should
But there,
share a temple with these Romans. I mean, they want their eagle in it, and
right, that wasn't the reaction. It was yeah, we know. Now, what was different was the enemies part, like you're saying. but again, like they would have understood that as within their tribe. Like the Samaritans would have been their enemies. They would
Right.
have just, whatever. They're Samaritans. They're the ones that stayed in Babylon or stayed in Assyria. They didn't come back. All that stuff. Or the ones that stay in Babylon that didn't come back or whatever.
Well, and Matthew is applying Jesus' teaching to the church. So now the church is filled with Gentiles who are believers.
Yeah.
And there seems very clear in Matthew to be a division going on between Jewish leaders who are excluding Gentile believers, and because of the history and because they are goyim and whatnot. And Jesus is saying, hey, don't do that. Even when people speak poorly of you, don't disrupt the harmony and unity of the community for a personal feud that you may have or a personal tax you may be getting and whatnot. Now, of course, that's different if the ministry is being upset by those things or whatever. But for personal issues, love these people, try to keep the peace, that sort of thing.
Going back to Leviticus 19 and the parallel with neighbor and your people, among your people, neighbor and fellow countrymen. If we're applying this downstream, like where people see something wrong is that like there are no lines, right? The lines are gone. So like to understand Leviticus 19 correctly or Matthew 5, like you need some kind of line to be able to distinguish loves, right? So like the modern church says, okay, well, since those lines are gone, and clearly the liberals have gone nuts and just saying everyone's in the image of God, so you just kind of love everyone equally. You give the guy that the pagan the same thing you would give your Christian next door. The church's answer now is no. Okay, that's not true. But what we need to do is place priorities. So they accept the idea that everyone is like equal or valuable, right? They're not going to argue that point. What they're going to argue is that yeah, we agree everyone's valuable, but you have to order these loves in a hierarchy.
Yeah.
That's the solution.
Well,
good.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say the further argument with that is if you're going to start putting hierarchies of love and then you start doing that in the church, you start skewing what love looks like in the church as well.
Well, so here's what I would say: you can have hierarchies of love, not hierarchies, right? Like you can have spheres of love, and therefore a hierarchy, I guess, or in
I'll call
terms
them like
orders of love.
Orders or roles of love.
Yeah. So, like, I mean, obviously, like even within the church, you have an obligation to your family that goes beyond your obligation to the larger church.
And I would say, like in that role, just going since you brought that up, where like you might say I have more of an obligation for those around me, and let's like putting in a family context, I have more of an obligation to my family than I do say to the Cato's family, right? But like if I were to go over to the Cato's house and then take Oswald and be like, I'm just gonna make you my kid now, like I'm going to give you the obligation that I have for my kids. That's actually hating Oswin, and that's hating the Catos, right? It's like even though my expression of love to my kids is quote unquote fuller because they're my children, it's not necessarily fuller. It's a different role. Like me fully loving Oswin as I am as intended as a Christian is to help the Catos, right, and assist where I is applicable. That's full love to them, right?
Yeah, no, I think that in terms of like resources, though, when we talk about, because if we talk about love as resource, and that seems to be where the New Testament is laying love the most, right? Because that's what John is like, hey, if you love your brother, and what does he mean by love? Well, if you see him in need and you have the world's goods and you turn away. So and James, the same thing, right? It's that idea, if you see the poor, you turn away from the poor. It seems to be love is expressed through resources. And so because of that, there's kind of an order there. Now, I think the problem is that when you order and you don't have a correct understanding of the neighbor, then you are going to be in conflict with this, which I think people don't realize is a direct command by Christ to not give your resources, your physical resources, to unbelievers. This is from Matthew chapter 7, verse 6. And this is in the context of resources and giving resources and obtaining resources to give to other people and have them for yourself and whatnot. Do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. Now, most people think, oh, that means like, don't keep teaching the truth to pagans. Don't keep
Wipe the
preaching the
dust off your
gospel.
feet, kind of thing.
Yeah. And that's not what it's talking about. It literally is telling you, one, dogs and swine are references to people who are outside the covenant community. And notice what you're doing. It's giving what is holy, and what is holy, your pearls. What do pearls represent in the Gospel of Matthew, in like the parable, for instance, the pearl of great price and whatnot?
Yeah.
It represents your wealth.
Yeah.
And so the idea is you're not to give your wealth in the context, again, of money and resources. You're not to give your resources to unbelievers who are just going to use them to destroy you in the church.
So, and I think, just quickly on that point, I think the other problem, so kind of connecting what you're saying with what Drake is saying, even when you're talking about resources within the covenant community, there is an order, right? So you're going to take care of your family first, and then the local church. And then if you have anything left after those first orders are provided for, then most people will say, well, now it's okay for me to go out and give my money to unbelievers. But the problem is that we live in a time now where we have a global economy and we have access to Christians all over the world. We have access to people not only in our local church, but we have access to provide financially to people in other cities and other countries even. And you as a Christian are never going to have unlimited resources. So the fact that the social gospel movement has pushed us away from caring for one another means that it's to the expense of someone in the church.
Right.
Because there are people in the church, maybe not in your church, but in churches in this world that are hurting. And when you give your $20 to the guy down the street because, oh, who cares, it's $20, you're stealing from someone within the covenant community.
Yeah, I've seen this. I've seen time and again, the church does not have the ability to take care of its poor because it gave a lot of its wealth to unbelievers. And now that is the equivalent of a man who has his own household with his own children, and he takes all of their food, walks down the street, and gives them to the children of someone else's family. And the Bible says you're worse than an unbeliever if you do that.
Yeah, totally disordered.
Yeah.
I'd say in light of what April's saying, which I think is a really good point. Like if you take that human example, well, let's look at how God loves too, right? One that doesn't have a limit to his resources. So God can love like fully at all times, all people, like however he chooses, to no limit. But even God doesn't do that, right? All of his love is focused on his people. He has the ability to do it, to everyone in equal measure, whatever, like some kind of force.
He could love Jacob and Esau.
He could do it.
Yeah,
but he doesn't. And not only that, but like, are we? Does the Father fully love us in Christ? Is there any less love for us in Christ than the Father has for Christ? Well, the answer is, well, no, right? But we don't get everything that Christ is, right? Christ is eternal. We don't have his eternality. We take his immortality. There are attributes of Christ that we don't get. We get all the ones that lead to everlasting life. But even in his love, we don't get everything. Christ does hold some things that we've never had, right, as far as the nature of God is concerned. But like, even in that, we're fully loved as we ought to be as true image bearers in Christ. And not only that, but like I said, God focuses his love on his people. It doesn't. If you bring up Hebrews 6, the only time like God's love touches an unbeliever or an apostate is only when they see it. They're around it. They can smell it, just like I can smell food. I don't ingest the calories by smelling. I just know it's around. Um, that's it. There's no focus love though on those who aren't his people.
Well, and just to make a caveat, because I know inevitably that people are going to be like, "Oh, then you just leave everyone to die," and it's like, no. Like, someone presented this scenario, and I won't mention who, but someone presented the scenario of that you have more obligation to the unbeliever down the street when his house is on fire than you do to the Christian in India when his house is on fire. And I was like, wait, hold on. The reason why you'd have more obligation to the unbeliever down your street is because you can't help the Christian in India when his house is on fire. You can't put out his house. You're not there. It's impossible.
This just goes back to what Drake was saying. You're not omnipresent. So.
Right.
Right.
However, let's actually make the scenario more equivalent to what's going on. That your neighbor's house is on fire and there's a Christian 2 doors down. Let's say your neighbor's right next to you, your next door neighbor, not this kind of neighbor, which is what people I think confuse. But your next door neighbor, his house is on fire. Or we'll say he's across the street. His house is on fire, and there's a Christian whose house is on fire on the other street. Who should you go help? And I would say, according to Scripture, you go help the Christian.
But Brian, America is covenanted with God, so everybody is your neighbor.
Yeah. But if it is just the guy across the street, then yeah, you would go help him because you
are an image bearer. That's what you do.
Right, because we are the image of God and we still need to preserve life as government.
Yeah. And
so you become if the fire trucks are all there, I'm just going to stay out of the way. I have nothing to do with it. But if I'm government because government hasn't gotten there yet, then I need to function as government, or I'm being irresponsible before God as well, because that's a different sphere over which I have responsibility to take care of citizens as an image of God. That's kind of the Noahic covenant type image. That's very different, though, than my obligations to the covenant community, and whether I should confuse those when I'm not government. When I don't, when I don't stumble across the guy who's dying of thirst and no one else is there to give him water, there's no government to give him water. When I'm not in that situation, do I still just hand out waters because I'm trying to be friendly and preach the gospel? And the answer is no. I give him a water if I'm government and he's dying of thirst and no one else is there, and I save his life. But that's very different. I'm doing that as an image of God, as government, versus the church, which I'm 99.999% the church, and very rarely in our lives, unless you actually officially are government, very rarely in our lives will we actually have to become government.
People understand this when it comes to their children. They just don't understand it when it comes to their spiritual family. So they'll say like, okay, if I see, if my kid is running into the street and there's someone else's kid running into the street, obviously I'm going to go after my kid, right?
Yeah, right.
Like everyone understands that. But then when you try to apply that same logic to the family of God, like these are the people who are in my family that I have an obligation to. It's like, well, whoa. You need to have an equal obligation to everyone.
Well, and who would look at the mother who goes after like another kid instead of her own as somehow, oh, she sacrificed her kid, how loving. We would be all disturbed by that. We'd be like, no, you should have loved your kid. That's understandable. We understand you have obligations to your kids more than the kids for, across the street or whatever. Now, if you can get all of them, great, but you can't. You can save one and not the other, and so that's your choice. You have to love one and hate the other. That's the point of it.
Right. And that's the thing. I think that you said it right there. It's not love for the mother to go after the other kid. It's like the obligation language is weird because it's like again, it kind of like levels the playing field for love, or like it kind of makes it two-dimensional. We're understanding like love is there are roles to love, just like there are like the husband and the wife isn't less to the image of God because she partakes in it in a completely different way than the man
Yeah.
does. But it's just a different role that is operated that people try to downplay as that's not it. If you act in this role, it's not as loving because it's not equal to this other thing that we put on a pedestal that is better or something.
Well, I think the big problem is that everyone reduces love to a feeling.
Yeah.
And I can have a universal feeling toward people.
Right.
It's like, but your feeling isn't going to like save me from starving to death. Your feeling isn't going to clothe me. Your feeling isn't going to shelter me from a storm. Your feeling's not going to, your feeling is doing nothing because it's not actually loving. Love is not a feeling. When love is called a feeling in the Bible, one of the very few, it is occasionally called, love is describing a feeling sometimes, but usually we translate it as affection. And frankly, it's usually like a desire. Like, for instance, we talk about how like um was it Ammon who like raped Tamara's sister?
Yep.
And it says that he loved her in the Septuagint. He used the word agape.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and
Some
it's
way of
like,
showing it.
yeah, and obviously like that's talking about like a desire,
Yeah.
a lustful desire that's selfish and wicked, and not even talking about like real. So when we're talking about the type of love the apostles are talking about as a fruit of the Spirit, we're talking about a love that focuses in on resources. And I think this is condemning to so many, even pastors, because they'll talk about how they love people and never sacrifice resources for them, never sacrifice for them at all. But it's all about feeling, and people are duped into thinking that, well, I'm loved by these
I'll
people.
be praying for you.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's like, be warm and filled. It's like,
Mhm.
oh, thank you, man. You really care about me. And it's like, well, yeah, you're going to die in like 15 minutes because you're not warm and filled. So it's this is not the love the apostles are talking about. They're not talking about a feeling. They're talking about resources, and resources are limited, and therefore you cannot love everyone. So now you need to choose. And if you're going to love the world over the church, now you're doing something that's wicked because you're doing what's right in your own eyes and not what's right in God's eyes, who tells you to love one another. And that's how they know that you belong to Jesus.
Yeah.
I think before we go on to the Good Samaritan thing, I think maybe it's important for people to understand that Christians do have love for unbelievers, but the love comes out in sharing the gospel with them.
Yeah,
Does
that's
not
right.
come out in sharing resources with
Yeah.
them.
Love
And
looks
those
to
things
the
should not
ultimate
be
need.
entangled.
Yeah.
Yes.
Love looks to the ultimate need. And actually, what you're communicating to unbelievers when you give them resources is that, because all the blessings of the kingdom, our resources ultimately are flowing from the world to come. They're because we are united to Christ, and we have the kingdom of God. We're heirs of all things. We're giving little parts of this to one another because of that. When we give that to unbelievers, we're communicating to them that they have the blessings of God in the world to come, even though they don't receive Jesus. So now we're preaching a false gospel with our resources, and that's not what they need. What they actually need is gold and silver I do not have, but what I do have to you, I'm going to give to you. And that is, here is the life that is offered by Jesus Christ if you believe in him.
Yeah, they don't need the cup of water, they need living water.
Yeah.
It's annoying. Well, I wanted to make just one final dovetail off something April said about the church not seeing one another as like family.
Yeah.
And I think that's I mean, I think that is one of the biggest shortcomings of the church right now is there is no understanding of what like man, it's frustrating because I think it's an issue that the church has identified and has preached against. Right, the church is not a social club. It's the people of God. I've heard many Reformed pastors say this. I think R.C.
Yeah.
Sproul said it all the time. And but the problem is like we might say that, but all the time the church is treated like a
Mhm.
social club because once the sport is not something I like, I'm gone. If there is a
Mhm.
person there that I don't like, I don't want to stay. Um, you're not my family member. You're just an acquaintance that I can leave at any moment. Uh,
Well, You know what's funny about all that is that when we started talking about the neighbor idea as it's your fellow Christian that you need to love,
Yeah.
we had so many people
All the hate
who,
comes out.
yeah, the hate came out and left the church because they wanted to love the unbeliever and ironically ended up therefore disobeying the very command to love your to love your neighbor. And so and I see that so many times. It's like April said, it's the liberals, but reality, it's everyone that
It's everyone.
evangelicals and everything who
Mhm.
really end up being kinder to unbelievers than they are to fellow covenant members.
Yeah.
To be
And
clear, I said liberalism.
well, yes, but it's
So
infected,
it's more the ideology that's behind it, and the ideology
right?
has infected the church as well.
Right. Well, and it's infected the church in fundamentalism because
Mhm.
fundamentalists do like social programs to try to attract unbelievers and give away resources. It's affected the church in terms of the mega church, in terms of like, well, we need to use even the resource of the church itself and even the
Yep.
assembly itself as a way to kind of
Mhm.
connect to the unbeliever and love the unbeliever over the neighbor, over the actual believer. And so this is no small idea. It has ruined American Christianity.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was at Calvary Chapel, they used to do this thing for Thanksgiving every year called Bless Fest, and they would have all the homeless people bust in, and they would feed all the homeless people at the church, and they would have, like dental services and medical services and all these services for these people. And so when I went one year to volunteer for this, the entitlement from these people do not care about God. They do not care about hearing the gospel. It
Yeah.
was it was like, there's this idea of, okay, well, we're blessing them and we're caring for them, and they're essentially with their attitude spitting in your face the whole time.
Yeah, we had a guy come in church and he's actually come to us twice and he didn't realize it because we had moved or whatever.
Oh, I remember this.
But
Mhm.
the first time he came, he's like, my daughter died. He gave us this whole
Yep.
story. And then second time he came, which was like a year or two later, it's like, my daughter died. I'm like, your daughter died again?
Yeah.
Man, dude,
Yeah.
what are you doing with your daughters? They're just dying off like crazy. And each time it's a ploy for him to get a lot of money because he has to take a bus ticket somewhere, and he needs the money for it, and he needs to take this trip to with his daughter. It's like, okay. But what's fascinating is like, I'm hungry. You guys gonna feed me or what? And it was just
Yeah, the
absolute
entitlement.
very entitled. And then I looked at
Mhm.
the other guys, one of whom left the church because of the neighbor teaching, and nothing, right? Nothing from them who believed in the neighbor idea. And then I'm like the guy who doesn't believe in it. We're dirt poor because I'm not paid by the church. And so I take this guy in my car just because the church hasn't been taught this yet. And I'm like, okay, well, the church is kind of making a statement like they want to take him and get something to eat. So I take him in my vehicle. Who the guy seems rather violent, frankly. So I take him in my
Mhm.
vehicle and I go up. He wants Jack in the Box, and I start to order a burger. And it's like, oh man, I want more than that. I want a whole meal. And so I use literally my last $8 I had for the week to buy this guy who was entitled a meal because the church that I was an elder at believed that he should or whatever, and I hadn't taught them otherwise yet. So I become an emissary for the church. But taking away from me and my family the last $8 we had to give to this pagan who clearly is ruled by demons and lying to the church. And like to me, that was like the final straw to where like I'm never gonna do that again. I don't care if the church believes this or that or whatever. They need to be taught otherwise. And I think shortly after that, I taught everybody this, and people went berserk.
And that's the true nature of the social gospel, where it becomes salvation becomes a privilege, and now
Yeah,
you're the powerful,
Mhm.
so you
yeah,
owe that power to the underprivileged
Mm.
who are the
right,
unsaved.
yeah.
Mhm.
Very liberation Marxist type
Yep.
theology, right?
Mhm.
It's
Yep.
yeah,
Crazy. Well, so the other we talked about the neighbor, or the Good Samaritan as another proof text that people use to say, "Well, see, the neighbor is the guy in the ditch." and that's that's just the normal, everyday, general guy.
Okay. Now an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus, saying, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you understand it?" The expert answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." Jesus said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." But the expert, wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him up, and went off, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, but when he saw the injured man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came up to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, who was traveling, came to where the injured man was, and when he saw him, he felt compassion for him. He went up to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him, and whatever else you spend, I will repay you when I come back this way." Which of these 3 do you think became a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in religious law said, "The one who showed mercy to him." So Jesus said to him, "Go and do the same."
Okay, so this is a fascinating study in people reading this passage and thinking it says one thing when it says like the opposite, right? So first of all, most people are like, well, the neighbor is anyone who needs your help. And it's like, no, that's not it. Now, first, if you look in verse 26, Jesus is replying to him, what is written in the law and how do you read it? In other words, the law is a reference to Leviticus 19 that we just read. Yeah. And so when he says, love your neighbor as yourself, that's Leviticus 19, as is written in the law. The law already tells you who your neighbor is. So Jesus isn't going to answer that question. It's already assumed that this guy going from Jerusalem to Jericho is a Jew, a fellow covenant community member, a neighbor. And so the text already answers in Leviticus who the neighbor is. Instead, what Christ is going to do is say, you need to worry about whether or not you are a fellow covenant member to other believers, whether or not you actually are part of the community, because you're not a part of the community just by your ethnic identity or even your religious identity. And so that's why you have a high priest go by and a Levite go by, and it's like neither one helps them. And so Jesus is ultimately saying those guys are not a neighbor. They're not a part of the covenant community. And this is part of the thrust of Luke in general, that basically you can claim all you want to be a part of the covenant community, to be a part of the church. But if you don't actually take care of the poor within the church, you don't belong to Christ and you're going to be cast out. So just like the rich man and Lazarus and whatnot.
Yeah, the ESV is kind of helpful in this because in 36 it says, which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor?
Yeah. Yeah, literally, if you go through the Greek, it's which one, and then you have a partitive genitive. So which one out of these 3, meaning not all 3 became a neighbor. And then you have, do you think became a neighbor to him? So you're not even inherently a neighbor. If the brotherhood of man wasn't true and everyone was your neighbor, how do you become something you already are? So either you have to become a neighbor because you're not a neighbor, or this text makes no sense in the other framework. So one, he's asking which one of them became a neighbor out of the 3. So only one of them, Jesus is saying, became a neighbor. And then he's saying you have to become that neighbor. And how do you become that neighbor? Well, by showing mercy to your fellow neighbor, to your fellow covenant member. That's how you show that you belong to that community. Isn't that what John says? You'll know that you are my disciples. They'll know you're my disciples by your love for one another. It's the same thing. That's John's neighbor passage. He just uses one another instead of neighbor.
Well, interesting. Like the Greek word has like a lot of semantic domain, right? I mean, a lot of times it just means near, right? So like John uses it when he's referencing them coming near the well of Jacob or whatever. And of course it can mean like neighbor too, but the idea is like obviously who is near the one, who is in proximity, who is the one that's actually visible to the other, because the other ones were near, like the Levite and all that, they were near the guy in the ditch. But they were as far away as possible, right? Like realistically.
Well,
The only one that was near.
etymologically, that's true. That originally had to do with like proximity or whatever. But I think that as the word develops, it's talking about not just proximity, but proximity in terms of covenant community. So who's like spiritually close and near? I don't know where you got John uses it for the where is that?
He uses it in John 5 8. Oh, so John 4 5.
Oh, John 4:5. Okay, but not of a person though, right? It's talking about.
No. It's an object. So it's just being like
Oh,
physically
yeah.
near the well.
Yeah. So when it's referring to persons in the New Testament, it always is talking about someone who actually is within the covenant community, who you consider within the covenant community. Now, people would say, well, but it's a Samaritan, and Samaritans are unbelievers. And
No,
how
they're
could he become his member? Yeah, that's the problem. Samaritans are not unbelievers. They believe in Yahweh. They follow the Pentateuch. They have like slight alterations, but it's not really in religion. It's more like, where the location of like Abraham's trying to sacrifice Isaac was and all that sort of thing.
And if there's
This
any
is
question
also
that
just go ahead, Drake.
I would say, if there's any question that, read the interaction of Christ with the Canaanite woman and Christ and the Samaritan woman. That
Yeah.
will show you how Christ.
Yeah, the Canaanite woman is like, no, and there's another example of what Christ's saying. It is not right when he comes across the Canaanite woman. It is not right to give the bread of the children to dogs. And again, that's a reference to people outside the covenant community. The children would be those inside. And he's not just saying, oh, it's not appropriate. He's saying it's not right. It'd be wrong for me to do that. And then by faith, she shows herself to be a part of the covenant community. And then it's like, woman, you have what you asked for. So now I can give it to you.
So people who don't have the perspective that we have, when they read this and they look at the three potential neighbors, right? You have the priest and the Levite and the Samaritan, which, I mean, frankly, using the Samaritan is just brilliant storytelling, because it just is like, it's like a little like gotcha,
Yeah.
It's a gotcha moment. What do they make of that then? If everyone is the neighbor, then it seems like the forcefulness of the story, it loses its oomph to it, because the point is to be like, these people that you would expect, right, who are going to be the neighbor and who are going to be caring for this person, they are shirking their responsibility. So how is that framed in another context?
Well, I think for liberals, it's, since we're all equal, that there are no theological boundaries. The real person that God's pleased with is the person who takes care of other human beings or whatnot. Which that's not Luke's point, because Luke's point over and over again is talking about that you may actually believe in Jesus, but if you don't actually take care of the poor, then you don't really belong to him. And that's Luke's big thrust. So that's the liberal idea is totally off. The evangelical one, I just think evangelicals don't even know how to take it once you tell them that the neighbor is the Samaritan, because they all think the neighbor is the guy who's injured.
Mm-hmm.
And then they just say, well, everyone who's injured and needs your help is your neighbor. And it's like, but that's not what the text is saying at all. That has nothing to do with it. If anything, again, the assumption is the neighbor is the Levitical 19 neighbor, which means your fellow covenant community member. And you can assume that then, yeah, anyone in the covenant community who needs your help is your neighbor. But the question is, are you going to become a neighbor by helping him? That's the question Christ is actually dealing with.
what we're seeing now is a emphasis on the nationalistic idea of neighbor. So like the reform world is going in a weird direction where it might even agree and say, yeah, the neighbor's not everybody, right? The neighbor is now, it's going to be your nation, it's going to be your tribe, it's going to be your, regardless if they're believers or not, right? It's just those in your vicinity. As this is Stephen Wolf's thrust, right? I
Yeah.
mean,
Mm.
I think he gets inaccurately accused of like kinism and stuff like that, but this ethnos, while not specifically um, race driven or genetically driven, is a cultural ethnos that becomes that encompasses this idea of who neighbor is now. So neighbor is your general vicinity, regardless of regardless if they're Christians or not. Um, and I'd be interested to see like how they would handle your next door neighbor's house on fire and the Christian's house who's 30 minutes away is on fire. Who
What
would you
color are
go?
the neighbors?
Or right, or yeah. So maybe this is a Muslim who just converted a week ago, and your actual next door neighbor is a Mormon who you get along with really well, who,
Yeah.
who's got more obligation to you.
Well, and just
But
to throw everything into the mix, right? Just to like mess people up altogether. If I were king, do I have more obligation to well, forget that, because I would say I probably have obligation to whoever's in my government or whatever. But let's say as a Christian, I want other Christians and other nations to get into America before any other pagan gets into America. And I even consider, if I displace liberals or unbelievers in America in order to get more Christians here to help them, then I don't mind doing that. That to me is correct. I would do that. Silence.
No one
I'm
disagrees with you.
yeah. Yeah, and I think the nationalistic guys would applaud that, right? I mean, they would. That is what they're doing. I think
Well,
their
would they?
intent is
Because
to
Yeah,
destroy
I
us.
don't
ultimately,
know. Would they?
that means that I want the Christians from Mexico up here, and I want the liberals to go down to Mexico.
Yeah, I
Like,
think they act.
would they be okay with that? Or
But
maybe
what
we can
about
agree to
They
that.
probably
the
would be.
just like the morally upstanding Mormon versus the Mexican Christian? Then they probably would have more of a pushback.
Yeah,
See,
I don't
I would
know.
rather send the morally upstanding Mormon to, white Mormon to Mexico and get the Mexican Christian family up here.
But see, I think this is part of it, is that there's been in some reform circles, there's been such an ethnocentrism that's been pushed
Yeah.
even ahead of having love for the global covenant community.
Yeah.
Yeah, they might say, Mexican Christian, you stay in your culture. We'll convert the Mormon Christian, or we'll convert the Mormon to the faith. They
Well,
might say something like that.
I mean, obviously, if all things were equal, that'd be fine. I'm really talking about if that Mexican family is starving as Christians, and the only way to really help them at this point is like get them out of Mexico and bring them up here. I would do that and displace the.
Okay, they would disagree. They would disagree with that because then, yeah,
Okay.
they say, uh, you know, we're you're breaking the law. As a Christian, you don't break the law. It would be
Oh, I'm
all
not
this
saying
stuff.
illegally. I don't mean
Oh, okay.
illegally. I'm just talking about in terms of immigration. Like if I have to displace, like
Oh,
if
like
it's
the
all
policy
full,
would be.
right, whatever. Like if you bring in this family, another family has to go down to Mexico or something.
I think many would agree with that.
Okay.
I think.
Let us know in the comments.
Or even
Yeah.
just send liberals out, even if you don't replace them with.
The problem I have is that everything is looked through a nationalistic. Like this is a hypothetical. If Brian were king, right? Again, if we had the Christian prince, right? And this is now a Christian nation, and my full obligation is to believers. Therefore, American citizens who are liberals, you're out, and you know, Mexican Christians, you're in. Open the borders. That's who we want. Um, uh, sure, but that's like we should write a book because we'll sell a lot of copies. Like realistically,
Mm-hmm.
That is not the reality we live in, right? Um, we live in a reality that we need to place Christians first. Like Christians need to be first, not my geographic neighbor or my cultural neighbor or even my neighbor in heritage, right? I don't, I frankly don't care about my pagan Norse pedigree, right? More than I do about the Mexican that I'm best friends with, whose family I'd love very dearly, or whoever, who is now my eternal family that I'll spend with Christ in the new heavens and new earth.
Yeah.
That's like ultimately that's what I care about. I don't care about the other stuff as much.
I
Um,
think if we're just talking practically, the best thing that Christians can do would just be to love other Christians who are around them, particularly who are in their local church.
Yes.
And we do a terrible job of this.
Yeah.
And actually love people. Love people who you are not friends with, love people who you don't particularly like, because let's be honest, everyone has someone in their local church that they're like, I don't really want to hang out with this guy. Love that person. Love that person with your
Ouch.
resources.
yeah, if that,
But
yeah,
take care. If everyone did that in their local church, everyone actually provided for the Christians around them, then a lot of these problems would go away.
no, it's absolutely true. And there wouldn't be church splits. Our church split would have been avoided if people did that. Right?
Yeah.
It would have been fine. And we could have like even aired that laundry out and be like, I have a hard time getting along with you.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, but you know what? This is where God has placed me. This is my family. I don't just leave my family because I have a hard time getting along with my mom or my brother or whatever.
Now I know why you and Emmanuel take care of us so much. Like, if we can actually just take care of that guy, we'll obey this.
We're just
So
like, we got to pick the person we like the least.
That's
That's
right.
Brian.
Who do we have the hardest
Take care
time?
of Brian.
we are sure to enter heaven if we can just
Yeah, that's how it works, right? It's however much money you shell out.
But it is true though, is that like it's ironic that the local church both meets both things, right? Proximity, and they are literally your neighbor
Mm-hmm.
that is
Yeah,
around
yeah,
you, and
yeah.
those are
Mm-hmm.
the people who are loved the least
Yep.
by Christians. It's always like, because we're so outreach minded, right? We're just like, oh, evangelicalism has been like, yeah, save the unbeliever. Let's outreach. And it's like, your outreach, according to the Bible, is loving one another, not going out to Fremont Street and preaching to a bunch of drunk people who don't care about the gospel. That's not outreach. I'm not saying you can't do that. I'm just saying, if you do that and then you bring them back to a community that doesn't love one another, you've preached a completely different message to them, and you're not actually, that's not transforming. There's something Christ says, that it's the community that tells people that you belong to Christ, that you have a legitimate claim to speak for Christ, because in fact you do love one another. And at the end of the day, we're all judged on, like, even though April makes fun and says, it's not really based on giving. Actually, the judgment really is, though. The judgment is in accordance with, do you really love Christ and therefore his people? And therefore it's what you have done to the least of these brothers of mine. And so I was naked and you clothed me, I was hungry and
Mm-hmm.
you fed me. And it's all of that. No one's judged for, well, I mean, how many people did you save by having a soup kitchen? It's like,
Yeah.
that's not in the judgment.
Right. This goes to a whole nother tangent of like what the purpose of the assembly. I mean, like again, like every theological thread you pull, you tug on 50 others.
Yeah.
And it's like, man, if and I hate to say I don't want to sound like a know-it-all or anything, but if we can reform like these fundamental things about worship and how is God worshipped in the new covenant, we no longer go to temples and slaughter slaughter animals and do the feast. Like there's a different application of worship now, and that's tied around the neighbor too, because worship of God is just going to Sundays, and it's like totally void of actually loving our neighbor. Is like, that's worship. Uh, God, frankly, is like, yeah, thanks a lot for the songs you sing, but are you loving each other? That's what I care about.
Mhm.
It's just like, yeah, all these things together kind of form a lot of this ideology of who your neighbor is, to the detriment of the church and the modern church and of the modern reformed church, because they see something's wrong, but their fix for it is still downstream of the original issue, which is
Yeah.
who is the image of God and who is your neighbor.
Well, when all the social justice stuff was going on, they had a panel with like Al Mohler and
Yeah.
MacArthur and all those
Mhm.
guys. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and there was a disagreement among them. And
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
and the disagreement was basically based on, even though they didn't know it, who your neighbor actually is and who you have a responsibility to. And so they're in conflict, but they can't identify what it is. You had those who just kind of assumed, yeah, well, we should take care of Christians first, and this is about Christians, even though they would never really explicitly say that consciously. And then you had those who were like, oh no, the neighbor's everybody, and they assumed that, even though they weren't really saying that either. And I think the problem is that people don't realize how powerful this religion is, how far it goes up and steeps into everything. R.C. Sproul used to say, not everybody is my brother, but everyone's my neighbor. And it's like, that's the same thing.
Mm.
And so the problem is it's so steeped in us. I have never seen people get so upset than over this issue. I guarantee anyone who sees this was not aware of this before, most people are going to be ticked off that we would dare even question this fundamental of their religion, which again is not Christianity, it's Enlightenment religion.
Well, and here's a way, I guess, for people to maybe wrap their minds around how it is a different religion. If you're going back to the verses that you were talking about with Christ saying, you saw me naked and you didn't clothe me, you saw me hungry, you didn't feed me. Who represents Christ to you? Who is actually in Christ? Who is Christ to you? It's obviously not the pagan. So is Christ saying, you saw me in the unbeliever and you didn't take care of me? Well, no, because the unbeliever is not in Christ. The unbeliever doesn't represent Christ to you. So ultimately, you need to be looking at other believers and you need to be seeing Christ in them and thinking to yourself, hey, I may not like this person, or I may not get along with this guy or whatever, but that person is Christ to you and you need to have that mindset.
Yeah. Yeah, well, even further, I think we see this sort of collapse of boundaries within Christendom, because we're just like, well, we just want to love everyone who claims to be a Christian. And it's like, well, what you're doing then is you're expanding this idea of the brotherhood beyond the borders of Christianity because you think that's more loving, when in reality it's like, the heretic is not my brother. The apostate is not my brother. I
The
don't
cult
care if he
member
has
is not my brother. Just
right.
because the Mormon says they're Christians does not make them your brother.
Right. And it's just, there's this, the reason why the whole fatherhood of God and brotherhood of man came about in the Enlightenment is because it's a reaction against the religious wars.
Yeah.
After the Reformation, you have the religious wars, and man, it just seems like a lot of Christians are killing a lot of Christians, and that's true. But the answer to it, unfortunately, for the Enlightenment was to basically flatten out and make up a religion that everyone could kind of agree with, so that we'd all get along. And you see that same tendency even within evangelicalism and the Reformed community to kind of like, let's lessen doctrine. Let's kind of lessen the borders and the boundaries, and let's all just be unified so we all kind of get along under some sort of more generic kind of something we can all agree with. And I think the problem is that love is always going toward God first, and God is found in truth and not apart from the truth. And God has set boundaries of what his religion is. God has set boundaries of what makes up his covenant community. And they're not as many as maybe people who are more judgmental would have. I think that's true. There are essentials, but we can't do away with those essentials and then say, well, these people are our brethren too. Let's not worry about doctrine and all that sort of thing. I love my brother by challenging him on doctrine. And I love my brothers by keeping up the boundaries that say inside this are Christians and outside of it are not.
You correct errors when you're teaching your children because you want them to learn.
Because you love them. Yeah. That's why you say don't run in the street. That would be an error that leads to death. So don't do that. It's not more loving to be like, oh, well, my child disagrees with me and I just want to get along and love them. And
they know the basics, so it's fine.
Yeah.
There's so much in clarity, right? Like John says in his First John that if we obey his commandments, right, that's an identification of our assurance, and his commandments aren't burdensome. Clarity is unburdening, right? So like when Christ goes after you have heard this, but I say, he's really like clarifying things, like making it really clear. And he's doing this with the neighbor too, right? So like it's really it's a huge burden on somebody to say, just everyone's your neighbor, there's no clarity, you do what you can for everybody. And that is very difficult. You feel like a constant failure. There's something that weighs you down.
Well,
But when you
go ahead.
No, go.
Well, I was just going to say it leads to indecision, right? We talked about this before with, I think we were talking about girls or something or whatever. When you have like a lot of options, and same thing with girls with a lot of guys or whatever, they say that people who have a lot of options, or if you go to a grocery store and there's like a million different brands of the same thing, they say it actually creates indecision. Like you're indecisive then, and you're not sure of what you should do. So you end up like not choosing. And this is I think a problem is if everyone's your neighbor and you need to give your resources to anyone who's in need or whatever, then maybe you might occasionally give to the guy down the street or whatever, but for the most part you don't end up giving. And that is a problem, because if the judgment is about you giving,
or you just give to the church and then you just let the church assume responsibility. So you'll say, okay, I'm going to give my 10% tithe, whatever, right? We can talk about that maybe a different time. You're going to get, the bare minimum and say, okay, I fulfilled my obligation to other believers, and now it's the church's responsibility. I don't need to actually, as a Christian, look for need and understand that there are people that are Christians that I am face to face with every day that may have a need. No, everything now becomes, well, the church is going to deal with that. I don't have to do anything.
Yeah, what's fascinating is that giving to the church is primarily to take care of the elders. Now it does have funds for the poor as well, but never was that meant to mean that therefore don't worry about taking care of the poor Christians around you individually. Now we did implement something in our church to try to stop certain people for asking for money when they were, irresponsible with it.
Yeah, like curbing abuses.
Right. It was to do that, but never was that meant to say to people, hey, if you legitimately see someone in need and they're going to actually, use it for that need, then obviously, take care of them. Because Christ isn't like just talking to the church when he says you didn't clothe me. It's really talking to, I think, church leadership in general, but also then by extension, the church at large.
But there are ways to provide for other Christians in a way that's wise. Like if you, if you had a Christian who was in a car accident and they need their car repaired, then you go take their car to be repaired. You don't need to just dole out money to everyone. Like you can meet those needs in a way that's wise.
Well, and ask your elders, like, are you guys doing something? Should I do something?
Yeah.
Should I not do something because this is, something I don't know? Ask your elders, like, just don't do something.
When Paul took the alms from the church in Philippi to Jerusalem. Well, the one who specifically is like Philippi to Jerusalem, I think, right?
Oh, I know he's talking to the Corinthians about that as well, but
was the Corinthians. Yeah. So you see, like, there's obviously the church is coming together. Like, okay, what do we need? What do we need to do? What do we need to
Yeah.
give here? So there's like an order to it. Not everyone's just doing their own thing. And like to your point, April, like it's like, what is the wisest thing for me to do? And I doubt everyone was able to give, but maybe one guy was the one that gave it to Paul or something, right? Like transported it over there to give it to him or something.
Yeah, you do
yeah.
have that to where the bulk of what you're giving is given to the church so that the elders decide, right? So like Ananias and Sapphira, they're selling and then they're giving the money. Everyone's selling stuff, and it seems that they're bringing it to the apostles to distribute or whatever, and then that would transfer to elders. But then you also have, it's very clear that like even John's talking to the church in general and saying, hey, if you see your brother in need and you love him, don't turn away. Like there's, so I think it's both and when you look at the Old Testament, that's true as well. It's here's this corporate giving, and the bulk of what you're giving is to like the temple through bringing sacrifices and food and your tithe and then your money to actually like to build up the temple and all that, which is a lot more than the tithe and whatnot. But then you also have, and I want you to leave your crops and the outside of your crops for the poor. So you've got individual giving, and you've got the more corporate giving that you give to the ministry.
Yeah.
And all of it should be done in love.
Right. Yes, this isn't something external over you that like makes you righteous or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Last thing I'll say is just going back to his commands not being burdensome. A lot of people think that means that they're easy. I don't think that John is saying that the commandments of Christ are easy. What I think he means is that they're clear.
Yes.
And for the Christian, it's going to be clear for them what they ought to be doing.
Yeah, it's not the Mishnah, even though everyone would want to make it that way when they don't want to give.
Right. And this is clear. The Christ's teaching on this is clear. The Mishnah, the Talmud version of what we see is evangelicalism.
Yeah.
That's the confusing, complicated Sabbath teaching, right?
Yeah.
Equivalent or something.
I got nothing else. Nope.
No. Trying to think if I have anything else. Man, it just connects to so many issues.
I know. It's like, and we also have a podcast about the image of God, because this is connected to that too. So if you're like, when you heard that statement, you're like, what does that mean? Just go back. I don't know.
We can link it below.
Yeah, link that, and you can watch that. That'll be helpful.
We might have been clearer in this podcast than I was when I taught that. Or wait, you're talking about the pod? Did we have another podcast on the neighbor?
No, we had a podcast on image of God.
Oh, on the image. Yeah. Yeah, those two really go together.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Thanks for watching. If you want to support our ministry, like, subscribe. When I say ministry, this is the time for us hanging out. That's like everything's a ministry these days. I was watching all right, side note. I know I'm saying bye, everyone. You just got to deal with this. You can click it off if you want to hear me anymore. I was watching like evangelical dark web, and he calls it a Christian news gathering and commentary ministry. And I was like, I don't know, man. I was like, oh, dude, you just want to like be mad at people and give your opinion. Let's not.
It's more like Christian entertainment.
Chris, it's like TMZ. Like you're just a Christian entertainment YouTube channel.
It's almost like Christians think anything they do is a ministry.
Everything, yeah, right. Because Ephesians says we're being equipped for that. So
the diaconate of gathering news.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a real thing. You know, there was tax collector booths and there were news anchor booths. Jesus called both of them. But anyway, so I would call this is a time of hanging out. Thanks for hanging out with us. Thanks for thinking with us. I hope it's challenging you as it challenges us. Comment below if you really want to support us. If you're like, this is the best ministry podcast ever, then join our Patreon. There's a link to it. You can become a fellow fighter pilot. You can be Red 6. I think how many in our squad now? I don't know. 4?
Not many.
Yeah, so we have Red. Huh?
On Patreon?
Yeah, it's like 4. Anyway,
I don't think
I don't
so,
want
but-
I don't want to give that intel out because then the Empire will squash us. But if
Let's
you
just
want
put
to
it
be,
this way: if somebody wanted to be Red 5 like Luke, we're not there yet.
there you go. We're not. That's right. We don't have the chosen one yet, or whatever he is. It could be you. Anyway, yeah. Join us on Patreon. Thanks for hanging out. We'll talk to you next time. Peace.
Bye.
Bye.
Haven't read the series might not understand what would need to happen.
Have you read all of them?
I've read all of Frank Herbert's novels. Yes.
Oh, you've read all of them. I've
I
only
have
read
read all
the
of
first one because my
I
grandma told me
trudged
that
through
the other
them.
ones were bad.
Let me just start with this. Frank Herbert is not a good storyteller. Not a good storyteller. He's a fantastic world builder. By Morgoth. I am your only future. But they don't like they're bred for war. So like Saruman like literally grows them in his
In like his vat.
yeah, in his
orc
vats,
vat.
right? And he like gives a sword to him and they go fight. That's like, and Uruk-hai are like better than the original orc or whatever because they can be in the daylight.
The reason why I like Moby Dick so much is, to me, there's a parallel with Genesis. So it's actually history. It's history that Melville he's interviewed. This actually occurred to a bunch of whalers.
Yeah.
And the survivors he interviewed.
Yeah.
And it became this book. But notice how he's writing this history. It's not, here's all the facts that happened. All right, the end. He's writing it because he wants to put meaning and a message to what has occurred.